Hey, hello everyone. Uh, I'm about to do a little bit of a lecture for my abnormal psychology classes. And in just a little bit, we'll be talking about somatoform disorders and then dissociative disorders. And we'll probably do that in two separate sections of the video. But to start with, I hope you're all doing as well as can be expected under this kind of weird sort of place that we're all at in life. So you know that we're in a situation now where the college is closed, and while there's no definitive answers, I would be surprised if we are back face to face anytime soon. You know, the college is taking it kind of day by day, week by week, but just from the looks of this, it's probably going to be a while. So we all have to take good care of ourselves and the people we care about and each other. As you know, this is a face-to-face course, and here we are online, and I've had very little experience with this, so it's a steep learning curve for me. A couple of things about that. First of all, it's going to be rough in the beginning in terms of we're going to have some rough edges. Let's just all expect that and make that normal and okay. We'll work it through. My goal is to make this as simple an experience for you as I can. But I also want to make sure we meet the goals of this course in terms of what you need to learn and what you need to master. But let me just say, I get it. Everybody's lives have been disrupted and tumultuous, and let's just bring our best self to this and make it work with each other. Certainly, to say the obvious, I'm not going to add any work to your plate. I'm going to reconsider certain possibilities. I'm going to give you some extra credit opportunities. And so, I'm also going to be sending you emails with update information and just kind of, all of the structural policies that we need to put into place and all of that. But, the abnormal psych class, really the grading, from my point of view, it's case studies, and you've already finished 2. There are 3 more to be done this semester, and I'll give you a lot of guidance on that and a lot of specifics about that. There'll also be an optional final at the end of the semester, which, of course, everything at this point is take home. So compared to my intro psych course, where there's more in-class exams, actually the abnormal psych grading really should be pretty much the same. Okay, so it's a process, it's a journey, we're on it. If you were in class, the last class that we met face-to-face, you may remember that we were talking about somatoform disorders. Those are the disorders in which a person develops physical symptoms, but what's really going on is psychological. And just to back up a step, I want to remind you that one of the things that we talked about were the differences between psychosomatic disorders, in which there is a real physical illness or disease, but the part of the cause of that disease is psychological, versus somatoform disorders, in which it looks like somebody has something going on physically. But the truth of the matter is it's being driven by psychological conflict and psychological anxiety. And as we talked about in somatoform disorders, a lot of this is taking place not consciously, but subconsciously. So a person is really not aware of the process of conversion that we discussed, in which a person unconsciously converts psychological problems into physical expression. We discussed somatoform pain disorder face-to-face right before the break. And just a very quick review, and remember that this is all in the book. And the truth is the main textbook becomes even more important for the rest of the semester, given the change in our structure. But in a somatoform pain disorder, a person experiences inexplicable physical pain. It often shifts from part of their body to another part of their body. The pain does not make sense medically. In a somatoform pain disorder, a person gets that, $1 million medical workup and they find nothing substantially wrong with them physically. We discussed how the location of the pain can sometimes reflect kind of psychologically what's going on. So chest pain in the heart area, I don't want to make it too literal, but the expression that we've all heard, to have a broken heart. We talked about the fact that where in the body the pain is located may sometimes have a backstory in terms of early childhood physical abuse and or sexual abuse. The second disorder under somatoform, so this is still all somatoform disorders. The second disorder that we talked a little bit about was once upon a time called hypochondriasis, i.e. a person who's a hypochondriac. It was renamed in the DSM-5 illness anxiety disorder. Whatever you call it, the symptoms are essentially the same. This would be somebody who, it's almost in some ways a little bit like an obsessional sort of disorder, in the sense that a person who's a hypochondriac tends to be very anxious and very obsessed with ideas relating to illness and disease. It's a pattern that often starts early in childhood. That obsessional fear and anxiety over being sick will often kind of wax and wane depending on what's going on in other parts of that person's life. So at times of increased emotional stress, you'll often see a kind of a wave of symptoms. Actually, if you think about what's going on right now with the coronavirus, right? This would be one of those times where anybody who's kind of hypochondriacal on a good day is going to really, given the stress and uncertainty that we're all feeling, a person who's a hypochondriac may get kind of a resurgence of symptoms right now, which might sometimes almost feel like they're mimicking the symptoms that they've read online about the coronavirus, or just other hypochondriacal concerns in general. So one of the things that happens with folks who have illness anxiety disorder is they can really be divided into two separate groups. One group of hypochondriacs become obsessed with going from doctor to doctor to doctor, getting test after test after test. And they do what's called doctor hopping, doctor shopping. They often have hostile dependent relationships with doctors and nurses, meaning hypochondriacs feel very dependent on the medical staff and medical profession, but at the same time, they tend to be very angry at folks. They're angry because they often feel they're not being taken seriously. They're angry because, from their point of view, their concerns and their physical symptoms are real to them. And so when they hear somebody say, but we've run every test and we can't find anything wrong with you, that tends to make them feel kind of threatened and vulnerable. But there's a second type of hypochondriac. The second type have obsessional fears, just like the first group does, but they avoid going to doctors. And they become almost terrified of any medical sorts of interventions or just going for a physical, because, of course, their belief is, how irrational we all can be, that if they go, they're going to hear the bad news that they're afraid that they're dreading that they're going to hear, which is that there is something really physically wrong with them. Not surprisingly, people with illness anxiety disorder and somatoform pain disorder wind up sometimes getting all kinds of surgical and medical interventions that they don't need. And one of the real risks for these folks is that some of them wind up getting addicted, especially with somatoform pain disorder, but also with hypochondriasis. Docs will sometimes prescribe meds because these people are reporting being in different sorts of, being in physical pain and so on. And you and I, living in America, we all know the slippery slope of getting addicted to opioids. And then when the opioids get cut off, converting over to drugs like heroin. So in all types of somatoform disorder, but especially somatoform pain disorder, this is a kind of a comorbidity and another problem that coincides with the original problem. So back to hypochondriacs. So what do we know about hypochondriacs? Well, not surprisingly, many adults who are hypochondriacs were more likely to experience physical, especially chronic physical illness in childhood. And I bet that surprises absolutely none of you. It kind of makes sense, right? If you're a little kid and you have a chronic illness as compared to your cohort group, there's going to be a lot of attention from parents and grandparents and your siblings and teachers and medical staff on that condition. And that can maybe sensitize you, make you focus a little bit more than is good for you on physical issues. But the other thing that we find that I think is really interesting is a lot of adults who are hypochondriacs grew up in families where the only safe, consistent, predictable way that they could get attention from the adults was by, quote unquote, going physical. Imagine growing up in a family where every time you as a child try to talk about something that's happening in you emotionally, you're scared or you're sad or you're angry, your parents or the adults just don't process that. They can't really pay attention to that. But when you talk about a headache or a backache or a stomach ache or some physical symptoms, that they can respond to. So in some childhood histories of adults with illness anxiety disorder, what we do see is the child almost learns the language of going physical early on as a result of that interaction in their family of origin. And then that way of living in the world becomes almost kind of a lifestyle to some extent. Hardcore hypochondriacs wind up with relationship problems because it's very difficult for them, even though they are capable of empathy, it's very difficult to show that empathy when you're obsessed with your own worries about your body. So if I'm a hypochondriac and you and I are talking, and you start to tell me you're just getting over a virus, well, maybe virus isn't the best example, but you're just getting over something, right? One of the things that's going to trigger for me is my own anxiety about my own health. And what I'm going to do, often without realizing it, is shift the focus away from you and onto me. You think that's bad? Let me tell you about how sick I've been. I grew up with a family of people like this. Trying to control myself because this is being videoed. Man, the stuff I could tell you. Anyway, now in all relationships, there are times that we accept, that it's okay if the focus is on you right now because you need to talk about what's going on in you. And that's all well and good. But in a long-term relationship, we get tired of that, frankly. And so hypochondriacs often lose the goodwill of the other people in their lives, and people get frustrated with them, and people kind of see them sometimes as unbelievably selfish, when it's really what we're not seeing is the anxiety in that person that drives that behavior. So again, it's one of the themes that we've covered earlier in the semester, where sometimes one problem, you can kind of get layers of other problems on top of it. Okay. So we've covered 2 somatoform disorders. I'm going to now add a third. And the third one, which is called conversion disorder, is really the one that there are many movies about and books about. It is conversion disorder, or what was once upon a time called hysteria, that made Freud famous over 100 years ago. A lot of Freud's early work as a psychoanalyst were with people who had the symptoms of what is today called conversion disorder. So the old term for conversion disorder is hysteria, and you will still hear that term sometimes used. In our case book, one of the cases that I'll be talking to you about down the road a little bit is called conversion disorder, hysterical blindness. And it's a true story about a man, a dad, who reads his daughter's diary. Without her knowing it, he discovers something about his daughter that he cannot psychologically handle. It creates tremendous conflict and anxiety in him. And as a result, he goes to sleep one night and wakes up the next morning and he's blind. He gets the $1 million neuro workup. Nothing's wrong with him physically. His therapist that he eventually sees uses hypnosis, and in a hypnotic trance, his vision is restored. So hypnosis Hypnosis may not be useful for certain psych disorders, but it is really useful in conversion disorder. If you're hypnotized and your blindness goes away, we know de facto that it can't really be physical. It has to be psychological in nature. So in a conversion disorder, basically what's happening is part of the body loses its function. You go blind, your hands get paralyzed, or something strange happens in the way your body is functioning. And it is, again, though it sure looks physical, the truth of the matter is that it is not. It is psychologically driven. It's driven not by conscious conflict, but by unconscious conflict. And there are several different main types of conversion disorders. So let me take you through the symptoms. Let's think of conversion disorders as coming in one of three flavors. And you can have more than one flavor at the same time. So some people with conversion disorder lose functioning of part of their body in more than one way. So let's start with the first group of symptoms. One of the symptoms you'll often see in conversion disorders is what's called loss of sensory functioning, loss of one of your senses. So, since you've been a little kid, you've studied all of the different senses: vision, hearing, taste, touch, smell, etc. And what happens if you develop sensory symptoms? There is a shutdown in one or more of those sense modalities. So hysterical blindness would be a sensory symptom because the sense of vision is shut off. Hysterical deafness, obvious. His hand, or what's called glove anesthesia, where all of a sudden a person's hand, you can move your fingers, but in terms of senses, your hand is numb. So you can stick a pin in somebody's hand and they don't feel anything. Any sense of the body can morph into a change in sensory functioning. The most common are hysterical blindness and hysterical deafness. Those are the two most common symptoms. Now, again, the proof of the pudding is going to be when this person gets a medical workup and they evaluate vision and hearing and there's nothing physically wrong, and then you hypnotize the person and they can see or hear again. That's really, again, evidence that this is an emotional process, not a real physical process. The second group of symptoms are loss of motor functioning. So group number one was sensory. Group number two are motor. And you know from earlier this semester that the word motor means movement. The ability of ourselves to move the muscles of our body, to move the muscles of our larynx, to speak, and so on. So hysterical paralysis, like let's say leg paralysis or arm paralysis, would be examples of motor symptoms. Mutism. I had a little boy as a client years ago who had been very traumatized by witnessing his mother being essentially murdered by the man in her life. And the father said to, not the father, the guy said to this little boy, if you tell anybody about this, I'll come back and I'll kill you. And horrible thing, right? And what happened was that little boy developed hysterical mutism. He lost the ability to speak because of the trauma and the terror that he felt. So paralysis, mutism are motor symptoms, right? And it's interesting to think about the paralysis. There's a famous case in the literature that goes back about 80, 90 years of a young man, about 19 years old, living with his parents in Europe, not in America. One day he has this blowout argument with his father. One of those arguments that's so fierce and so intense and so angry that this young man runs out of the house because he's afraid that if he stays, he's going to, punch his father and beat him up. Comes back, goes to sleep, wakes up the next morning, and both of his arms are paralyzed. And of course, what Freud would pose at this point is consider how the symptoms of bilateral arm paralysis actually solve a problem. If I can't move, hold on a sec, excuse me. If I, back again. If I can't move my arms, then I can't make the fist and punch you and beat you up. It's actually one of the interesting ways to think of these symptoms is that the symptoms actually serve in some way to help a person deal with something that they're really terrified of. The famous case of one of Freud's famous cases of a woman with leg paralysis that developed suddenly after she became sexually aroused for the first time in her young life. Remember, with Freud, this was during the Victorian era, where women were not really allowed to be sexual beings. And by developing leg paralysis and having her legs locked together, it's a way to avoid what she really wanted to do unconsciously, at least part of her did, which was to have sexual intercourse. So it's always interesting to think with a conversion disorder, what problem do the symptoms attempt to solve? This is one of the themes from beginning of this semester. Symptoms are both problems, but they're also attempts to do the best we can to solve, often a different problem. The third group of symptoms in conversion disorders are sometimes like the most mysterious. And these are called changes in visceral function, V-I-S-C-E-R-A-L. And the word visceral comes from the word viscera, which means your organs of your body, your heart, your lungs, your liver, your intestines, and so on. There are times when a person psychologically and unconsciously will alter the functioning or experience the alteration of a functioning of some part of their body. Let me give you a couple of examples. One example is pseudo heart attack, in which a person develops many of the physical symptoms of actually having an MI, a heart attack, right? Jaw pain, radiating pain down the left arm, a crushing tightness in chest, crushing chest pain, angina. And of course, if you show up in an emergency room, especially if you're a guy my age with symptoms like that, you won't have to wait. They're going to take you in immediately. But in pseudo heart attack, of course, what they do is they run all the urgent tests and they rule out any sort of real heart problem. And again, I think it's interesting to think if you feel like you're having a heart attack, okay, it's real to you, right? You're not faking it consciously. It's not malingering that we talked about a couple of classes ago. It's happening. But what is that really an expression of? And might it be sometimes an expression of something that symbolizes, that you symbolize psychologically in your heart, having a broken heart, right? Wounded, whatever. There are also really fascinating ones like pseudo-pregnancy, which we might have talked about in at least one of my abnormal psych classes, in which a woman develops over a period of time some of the signs of being pregnant. Her periods will stop, her belly will begin to swell, she'll start to carry her body weight differently in terms of the way a woman does as she's moving through pregnancy. And she experiences herself and morning sickness to be pregnant, but there's no fetus there. In the old days, before high-tech tests, there were documented cases of women going for a full 9 months of a pseudo-pregnancy and then developing, going into labor and delivery and having contractions and giving birth to absolutely nothing. Nowadays, that tends not to play out that way because, at least in America, because sonograms and all of those sorts of tests kind of reveal the lack of a fetus earlier. But you will still see that in parts of the world where medical testing for pregnant women is not really a routine thing. One of the things that's been observed, and again, I think this won't surprise you, is that pseudo-pregnancy is rare. Let me just put that out there. But when it does happen, it tends to often have been associated with profound loss. And sometimes that could have been the loss of a child, of a previous child during labor and delivery. It could sometimes not have to do with the loss of a child, but other sorts of losses in terms of relationships. Now, what I'm about to say with all of these disorders, including conversion disorder, could sound elitist and arrogant, and I really don't mean it that way, but these disorders were more common in the United States 100 years ago than they are today. And one of the reasons for that is as people have become better educated and more knowledgeable about science and how the body works, it's harder to psychologically pull off one of these disorders, right? So the more sophisticated people become about science and the way the body is really organized and what can and can't happen physically, the less likely we'll see these disorders. They are more common in the United States today in people with less education. And that is simply because they've had less exposure to understanding how science works and how the body works physically. They are also somewhat more likely in people separate from intelligence who literally interpret the Bible. And if you think about it, you can kind of almost see where that might be coming from, right? So not to step on anybody's belief systems, but to interpret the Bible literally is a certain sort of framework. It's a certain sort of mind, right? And really in which science does not necessarily play much of a role. So for some folks today, you'll still see these disorders, but they tend to be in folks with less formal education and also in people who have a certain worldview that kind of sustains this sort of idea that everything's psychological. It's not really psychological, it's really manifested in the body. I think, though, that in a less dramatic way, you see somatoform-like behaviors in people who grew up in childhoods where they never learned how to name their feelings. And that may sound like a real strange idea to some of you. How could you not know what a feeling is? But honestly, not everybody in childhood grows up in a world where they are taught to name their feelings. There are adults who look sad facially, who move sad, who talk sad, but they don't know that that's sadness. And that can also be true for other emotions like anger. It can also be true for emotions like anxiety and fear, especially in men, because men often do not learn the language of being able to recognize that emotion. And even if they recognize it, many men don't feel comfortable talking about or sharing that emotion. So I guess another way to put it is that while anybody can have somatoform moments, some people have a lot more of those moments than others. Now, the challenge in therapy is when you go physical and that's real to you, every time somebody tries to suggest to you that it might really be something going on emotionally or mentally, a lot of folks get very angry and defensive because they feel they're being dissed. And I get it. I understand where they're coming from. But at a more fundamental level, it's easier to have something wrong with my stomach than something wrong with me emotionally for some people. So when you're doing therapy with folks with somatoform disorders, you can't attack the problem through the front door because they're out, they're gone, they're not coming back. They're going to look for somebody else. You have to kind of reframe, and that's why CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, can sometimes be useful. And you have to be very careful about your use of language as a therapist when you're working with somebody who's got a somatoform disorder. The word anxiety could be a non-starter for them because anxiety means you think I'm mental, right? So you use the word stress, right? Stress is a more acceptable American cultural term than the word anxiety or the word fear. Folks with somatoform disorders present a range of, just like everybody else, a range of treatment challenges. It used to be thought about 10, 15 years ago that, for example, hypochondriasis was essentially untreatable. Very pessimistic take. It's difficult to treat, don't get me wrong. But there are some new kind of cutting edge CBT techniques and ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy methods that really seem to be kind of giving us a more optimistic picture on the treatment for somatoform disorders. Okay, so we're coming up on 30 minutes right now, and I am going to end this in just a moment and come back probably tomorrow and finish up this lecture with another 30 minutes or so on dissociative disorders. We'll be talking about dissociative amnesia and fugue, and then, of course, the famous one, DID, which dissociative identity disorder, which was once upon a time called multiple personality disorder. Again, though, before I sign off for right now, what I want to remind you of is that the book is real important. So what we've talked about today, these 3 somatoform disorders, get to the main textbook, dig into it, and I will talk to you again very, very soon. I'm going to finish this second half before I send this out. I am doing this right now at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night. This is what my life is. Look around at this white, empty room that I'm in. This is it. This is all I got right now, except for my cats. We'll talk about them more next time. I'm sorry. All right. Be back soon. I'm going to finish this tomorrow, and then I'll get the link sent out to you.